감사합니다, 목사님. You can take that. Okay, so I have this. Yes, it's working. Good. Okay. All right. So how do I go backwards? Okay, so right click, and then where's the previous? Okay, I see. Okay, good. Thank you. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It's so good to see all of you here. They say when I do college teaching, I do. This is actually part of a seminar we do for seminary. We talk about healthy churches. But I always say the worst time to do seminar is right after lunch, after eating a spaghetti meal. Because if you want to fall asleep, that's the number one thing. You get spaghetti plus a seminar. So anyway, what I want to do is I want to walk you through some really simple understanding of what does a healthy church look like. Because here's the problem, I think. One of the major challenges that we face is as we get older, physically, we know that one thing is common among all people that get older. Somebody once told me, you know you're getting old when the conversations you have with other people is about what procedure you had, what medicine you take, and when was the last time you talked to your doctor. It's funny because now I'm 56. And when I was in my 20s, I never talked about medicine. I never talked about my hospital visits. But now in my 50s, that's almost like the first thing that we talk about. And my parents, that's all they talk about. My parents are in their 80s. So we know that physically, as we age, that our health becomes much more an important discussion. Well, I think in the same way, the church, we have to think about health as well. As the church is getting older, I was talking to Jay today, the church is over 40 years old. And so as the church is older, what does a healthy church look like? Because a church in the Bible is a living organism. Just like the human body. The number one analogy that the Bible describes the human body to is the church, right? The church is like a body. And so in the same way, the church has to be maintaining its health. If it doesn't, just like the human body, it could start to have some disease as well. So what we want to focus on is what does church health look like? Now, when we focus on church health, there's always two subjects, church growth and church health. Church growth is what most pastors talk about. How big is your congregation? What's your budget? They talk about how big we are, what building we meet in. But that's the wrong question because really the growth is secondary to the health. Health is what's below the surface. And so when you think about church health, you have to see what is the underlying thing. Now, a church could be large and still be unhealthy. Recently, there was a major podcast on a church called Mars Hill. It was in Portland, Oregon. Brandon knows this very well. Mars Hill, during the time that Pastor Brandon and I were in Oregon, it was one of the largest churches. They grew up to 10,000 people. They had probably about 12 campuses all across the United States, maybe more than that. And in 1 year, it went from 10,000 to 0. The pastor had some major issues of character flaws. Eventually, the church went from 10,000 to nothing. So a size does not determine health. Health is what is important, essential for health. So when you look at that chart, you see that church health is below the surface. It's the root systems. It's the thing that allows the church to flourish. If the church health is bad, eventually church growth will be affected. Now, when you look at church health, there are actually, there's a book written by a Christian sociologist named Christian Schwartz. He did a survey of, I think it was 10,000 churches all across the world. And in these churches that he did 10,000 survey, he looked at 8 qualities of a healthy church. So it's called the book has to do with church systems. And there are 8 core things that we're going to be looking at. But I just wanted to share these with you quickly. The first quality of a healthy church is empowering leadership. What that means is how are the people being empowered to lead? Is only one person doing everything, or are people being equipped? Elders, leaders, small group facilitators, whoever they are, empowering leadership is one of the key elements of a church growth system, church health. Secondly, if gift-oriented ministry. What they mean by gift-oriented ministry is people are identifying what their spiritual gifts are and using it. Healthy churches give people a sense of finding what they're good at and incorporating people into ministry. Unhealthy churches, oftentimes, gift orientation is not theirs. Third characteristic, and this is why I think Pastor Brandon did this revival with this idea of passion for Christ. The third healthy mark is passionate spirituality. People are excited about what they believe. One of the things that happens with age, as we get older physically, is our emotions, we get tired easy. Spiritually, the same thing can happen. The longer we've been at church, the more tired we get spiritually. I think one of the things that we had a good conversation in our for lunch. I was talking to some young adults, and we're talking about how fatigued and spiritually tired they are. I think COVID has accelerated that. So unhealthy churches, spirituality is not as passionate. It becomes much more of a duty. The fourth is functional structures. This is where I think a lot of Korean churches struggle in healthy churches. Functional structure is having systems that are healthy. And we're going to look at some examples of that later. But functional structure is important. Who's in leadership? How do you develop leaders as well? The fifth quality of a healthy church is inspiring worship. Inspiring worship is you come and God is working through the music and through the sermon, and your life is transformed. Unhealthy churches, inspiring worship service is not part of it. Number 6, holistic small groups. Healthy churches have small group systems. I remember when I was at a church, one of my pastors said this: as the church gets larger, it has to get smaller. Healthy churches have good small group systems. I know my parents, when they were going to church, in a Korean church, they had kuyok ye배, right? They had all these small group communities. And that's so important for the church to grow. That's where community happens, especially in large mega churches. I went to a church of 5,000. Even though the church was 5,000, they had hundreds of small groups, because small group is where you find your community. Number 7 is need-oriented evangelism. One of the most critical aspects of healthy churches is that they are outward focused. In other words, evangelism is a critical part of healthy churches. Unhealthy churches focus more on just the Christians themselves. Healthy churches focus upon reaching out to their community. And then here's the number one quality, I think, is loving relationships. Healthy churches, they love each other. They love the community. They love other people. They love each other. If you are starting to diminish in your affection for each other, then that's a sign of unhealth. So anything in the body is fluid, meaning you could be healthy one day, and next day you have a heart attack. I was talking to Mike about his recent heart attack. How many years ago was that, Mike? 5, and he was a healthy man. He didn't realize that there was a blockage in his heart. And one day, he started feeling pain in his arm, and he went to the hospital and found out it was 100% blockage. That happened almost overnight. He didn't know his body internally was actually diseased. And in the same way, the church can become like that. The church can be diseased, and one day we wake up, and we wake up with a spiritual heart attack. So one of the things that we're going to talk a little bit about is these aspects. Just like the physical body needs to have regular checkups, the spiritual church also needs spiritual checkup. Just because you're an older church doesn't mean you're healthy. Age has no correlation to health. Oftentimes, age is the opposite correlation. The older you are, the more unhealthy you become, because you sort of establish patterns that can become very unhealthy. So For those of you who are older, you have to go see the doctor a lot more than when you're younger. Isn't that true? And I think as you get older spiritually, you have to have more spiritual checkups, because if you don't, you can easily fall into a pattern of unhealth. Now, in healthy churches, there's usually 5 areas that we talk about. Saddleback Church kind of developed what they call their bases, 101, 201, 301. But these are sort of the 5 areas that I like to see if a church is growing healthy. I started 2 churches, one in Washington, D.C., and after planting that church, I went back to L.A., and then a second church I started, L.A., was in 2000, and then I just left in 2020. So I was there for 20 years. And this is how we developed our church, around these 5 important principles. Number 1, the first principle was connecting one another. Healthy churches connect people to the church, connect them to each other. Secondly, healthy churches emphasize spiritual growth. And so we get them plugged into a small group quickly. Thirdly, we helped our church develop a serving ministry. There's a principle called the Pareto principle that says this, that 80% of the church is done by 20% of the people. In most churches, that's not healthy. Most people in most churches, only a small percentage do most of the work. The goal in our church was actually the opposite. We had 80% doing 100% of the work. And so one of the things that healthy churches do is to mobilize people for service. The fourth thing that we did in our church was leadership development. Here's one way you could determine whether a church is healthy or not. You look at who are you developing as leaders. If leadership is all one age, then it's not a healthy mark. It has to be leadership has to be in all stages of life. I remember when I was at an American church. I looked at their leadership team, and everybody was elderly. And there were not a lot of younger leaders. And I asked the question, where are the younger leaders? And they said, to become a leader at this church, you have to serve for this many years. And so what they were doing is rather than decentralizing leadership, they kept the leadership to very, very few people. Leadership development is one of the critical aspects of healthy churches. So I remember in one church in particular in Chicago, they were hiring pastors, and they hired 4 different pastors. And it was interesting. It was by age. So the pastor was in his 50s, so he hired an associate pastor in his 40s, then he had another pastor in his 30s, and then another pastor in their 20s, because he wanted a pastor for every generation, because they realized that the older we get, the more centralized leadership becomes. And then lastly, and this is what I think is critical as well, healthy churches commission people to go. In other words, people are outward focused. Healthy churches focus on outwardness. Unhealthy churches often focus on just the inwardness. And so they get older, and they diminish, and they get unhealthy as well. Now, we talk about in baseball, you don't get credit for leaving runners on base. What counts is not necessarily how many people come to church. That's the wrong measurement. How many people come to your church is not a measure of success. How you mobilize your people and send them out, that's the mark, I think, that's important. And so one of the things that you always emphasize in healthy churches is you focus on outwardness of the church versus just the inwardness. So evangelism has to be just as critical as discipleship. They come together. Now, so how do you develop a health of your church or plant that will allow you to grow and reproduce? That's the question we're going to look. How do you continually foster a healthy church? Now, one of the things that I see symptomatically across Korean churches is that many Korean churches are getting older and older. I see this in LA all the time. And when I went to Korea about 4 years ago, before COVID, many years ago, Korea, we had all these large churches that are hundreds of thousands. Now you go to Korea, and what you find out is that the young people are not going to church, and churches are getting older and older. And as a result, that's symptomatic of one of the problems that we see, is that the spirituality is for the older generation, and the younger generation have sort of been left outside. So we want to kind of focus on that. How do you focus on developing a healthy mindset? So here's some interesting, this is from a study done from all these churches to find out kind of, it's like if you're a medical doctor, there's some doctors here, we have these tests that we do to measure, and there's sort of a baseline. See what's healthy and what's unhealthy. Well, this is actually from all these churches across the world, and they kind of narrowed down some key findings. So one thing about church is that it's a combination of two factors. There's God, and then there's the people. And we're both, working together. Healthy churches, there's what we call natural church development. So God does his work, and we do our job. So in 1 Corinthians 3:6, Paul says this, I planted, Apollos watered, but God made it grow. So ultimately, there's a correlation or a connection between the work of God and the work of man. So we are responsible to create a healthy church environment. Now, there are different systems in the body, and for those who are in the medical field, you understand the importance of all these different systems: skeletal system, muscular system, circulatory, nervous, and all that. What that shows us is that the human body has all these systems that need to work together. Because if they don't work together, if they become diseased, what it happens is that all aspects of the human body gets diseased. And as a result, part of health is that the church is filled with systems as well. And these systems, if they're unhealthy, could also affect the other part of the church. So, there are 8 to 10 systems that we looked at that are critical to evaluate the human body. If you were going to see a doctor, these are the checkups that you would have. And so, I'll just quickly list them for you. We see that the first thing is the centrality of God's Word. Healthy churches have a strong emphasis on the Bible. And that's one of the things I've seen, is that they teach the Word of God. It's not just human opinion, but it's really the Word of God becomes foundational. So the question I like to ask churches is where is your basis? Where is your foundation? The thing that the Word of God is the living Word of God. And so one of the criterias, even if you're looking for a new church, I always emphasize this. A new church, if the pastor's not preaching the Bible, then he's preaching his opinion. And that's not healthy. Secondly is we talk about passionate spirituality. The thing I loved when I went to Korea more than anything was to see young people who are passionate about their faith. I mean, they were so passionate. And I think that's what describes Korean spirituality more than anything. Did you know that next to America, Korea is the second largest mission-sending country in the world? A small little country sends out more missionaries than any other country next to America. Why is that? Because somehow Christians believe that their mission was to transform the world. And these young people went all across to some of the hardest places. You will find Koreans in almost any part of the world doing mission work. And that's a beautiful thing, because their spirituality was really passionate. Third is fruitful evangelism. One of the questions we ask in churches is, how many people have you led to Christ? Here's one mark of an unhealthy church. And by the way, most churches in America are not very healthy. 50% of churches in America did not see one new convert come to Christ. Which tells me this, that most churches in America are maybe getting to a point of really unhealth. So the question I like to ask is, how many people are coming to know Christ? In a healthy church, there are more baptisms and more salvations oftentimes than people who, that's how the church also continues to grow. The fourth aspect is worship, high impact worship. Why do we go to church? Well, we go to church because we come to worship God. This is why I think video sermons, just watching a sermon on YouTube is not a healthy, sustainable spirituality, because church is not just about hearing a sermon. Church is about joining together in community. When we worship together, there's something that happens that is transformative in our spiritual life. Fifth is mission, vision driven. A church that is healthy has a mission and vision for the future. Here's one way I make a distinction between unhealthy churches and healthy churches. Unhealthy churches focus on the past. This is what we did. Healthy churches focus on the future. This is what God is continuing to do, how we are going to be participating in the work of God. Number 6, leadership development. Healthy churches have what we call a leadership pipeline, meaning that they have a system of developing leaders. If you look at Jesus, the number one thing Jesus did in 3 years was not to preach, not to heal people. You know what he did more than anything else? He discipled 12 men. His whole philosophy was to transform the world through these 12 disciples, even though one didn't make it. 11 out of the 12 eventually became ones who transformed the world. That was Jesus' strategy, to develop disciples for leadership. Number 7, healthy churches plant new churches. Now, what I mean by that is they reproduce, they multiply. They multiply services, they multiply a church planting. I planted 2 churches, one in D.C., one in L.A., and then out of our church, we planted 12 other churches all across different parts of the world. And the thing I love, when you start a new church, new people come to know Jesus. So I love church planting. 8 is financial stewardship. Healthy churches have a healthy understanding of finances. They're generous. They give. And then number 9, they have intentional discipleship ministry, DM. Healthy churches focus on discipling people into spiritual maturity. And lastly, loving relationships. I think if there's anything that is the most obvious for us is this, that if you come to church, do you love one another? If you don't love one another, then it's an unhealthy church. If you truly love each other, you love your pastor, you love your people, and it begins with the pastor. Does the pastor love his people? And do we love our pastor? I think healthy churches, it's like a healthy family. Same system. If there's always fighting between the husband and the wife, and the kids realize that, then it's an unhealthy family. So love has to be a dominant factor for health. Now, one of the things that in this particular study that they looked at is our research tells us that there's not one single factor that leads to growing churches or healthy churches. But every church has a scale. So, and you have to understand, and this is the thing that this is Christian Schwartz's study, over 10,000 churches. He says this, you have to find out what your strength is, and the way you become healthier is focus on the areas of weakness, and then you focus on that area, and then that area of weakness, hopefully you increase, and then that will allow you to balance your church. So as soon as a church reaches 65% index in all 8 essential growth resulted in the churches became healthy and growing. So basically, if you look at these 8 to 10 factors and you have one that's very lacking, that's where you want to emphasize, because once you reach a 65 index, then you reach what we call qualitative and quantitative growth. In other words, churches become healthier. Now, so pay attention. Oh, so I'm sorry. This is, it's what we call the 65 hypothesis. So one of the things about healthy churches is churches become healthy by hard work, by working together, by paying attention to health. If you don't pay attention to health, then you become very unhealthy very quickly. Growth takes care of itself. So here's what I always tell churches. Don't focus on growth, focus on health. Because if you're healthy, your churches will grow. What happens in a healthy church is if you love your church, then what you do is you invite other people to come to your church. It's just a natural thing. If you don't like your church, if there's conflict and dissension, then what ends up happening is that churches become very difficult places to invite people. So naturally, what you want is a healthy church creates a healthy environment for the church to grow. So as Jeremiah 17:9 says, "But blessed is a man who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence in him, he will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots on the stream. It does not fear." So when the roots are strengthened, it will eventually bear fruit. Okay? Now, health and size. The presumption is that large churches are good churches. Is that true? Well, here's the problem. Large churches in America does not necessarily mean it's healthy. There are a lot of large churches. We were talking about even a church in Houston, Texas, where it was a huge church. And during a hurricane a few years ago, the church closed their church to the people coming in, even though people needed housing, because the pastor did not want the sanctuary to get dirty. That's an unhealthy church, even though it's one of the largest churches in America. So here's the thing. There is no correlation between size. You can grow a large church with being unhealthy. By the way, cults grow fast, not because it's healthy, but because it's unhealthy. Something that grows fast, for example, if you do any kind of gardening, you know the number one danger of gardening is weeds. Weeds grow faster than good fruit. Why? Because again, weeds are unhealthy. And in the same way, just because you're large does not necessarily mean you're blessed by God. But at the same time, small churches doesn't mean because you're blessed by God either. Some people say, "Oh, we're small. We believe, we're the holy, sanctified ones." And the reality is, sometimes churches are small because they're unhealthy as well. So in small churches, 46% of attendees have been assimilated. In large churches, only 12% of the congregation. In other words, sometimes it's healthier in a smaller church than large churches if they don't have the system in place. In small churches, here's the great news about being part of a small church. Small churches can actually mobilize their people better. In small churches, 31% have a ministry assignment based upon their spiritual gifts. In larger churches, it's only 70%. One of the reasons that people go to large churches, and this is, so I work in a church in Chicago. We have 5,000 members in that church. I'm what they call pastor in residence. I'm a consultant for that church. So I go there 4 or 5 days in 1 month. And they have 5 campuses. And one of the biggest struggles that they have is it's a large church, is a lot of people come to their church to become spectators. The sermon is great. The pastor, pastor's a really good communicator. But most people go to church just so they can listen to the sermon and go home. That, to me, is not a healthy church. So we talk about ways, how do you become healthier? Well, we have to mobilize our people into small group ministry, into Christian community, into serving. Because if they're not doing that, it doesn't matter how big the congregation is. We also look at evangelism and gifts. Are people sharing their faith? Another mark of a healthy church is people are sharing their faith. And that's one of the things that is so important. If you look at this chart, you see that actually in smaller churches, there's greater effectiveness of evangelism. But oftentimes in larger churches, oftentimes that effectiveness decreases. So the reality for us is large churches can be healthy, small churches can be healthy, but size does not indicate health. Just because you have the largest church in the area does not mean you're the healthiest church as well. So healthy churches come in all sizes: small, medium, large, extra large. You could, it doesn't matter what size you are, you have to focus on health. So we talk about this called the minimum factor. Don't measure yourself against other churches. Measure your church against yourself. Small churches can have very effective ministries. Now, we look at the minimum factor. So if you imagine if you have a barrel, and the barrel, based upon the lowest sort of sea, will determine where the water comes out. So the key in developing a healthy church is finding out what your strength is, also finding out what your weakness is. The length of the barrel staves determine the amount of water it can hold. So you want to find out what is your minimum factor. So out of the 10 things that we listed, you want to evaluate, and as elders, ask yourself, what are the things that we're lacking? That becomes your minimum factor. Your minimum factor is what you have to increase for the church to become healthy and growing. Now, unlimited growth is not natural. Growth is not limited to God's creation. A healthy organism doesn't keep growing indefinitely, but brings forth other organisms. So as the church gets bigger, now, if you have a baby that's enormous, that's not healthy. Okay, there's something biologically wrong with that child. But as the child normally develops, the important thing is that they begin to reproduce. One of the interesting marks of healthy churches is that as they get older, they start reproducing more. My hope is that as a church here, what is your vision for multiplication? Church planting and missions as well. So, unlimited multiplication is natural. A tree does not get bigger, it brings forth new trees. One of the principles is multiplication. Healthy churches multiply. They multiply disciples, they multiply other churches, they multiply leaders. And if a church is not multiplying, then it's not fulfilling its call and commission by God. Do you know the first command in the Bible? What's the first command that God gave to mankind? Be fruitful and multiply. Biologically and spiritually. That's the first important principle of mankind. Our job is to reproduce. Reproduce disciples, reproduce others. That's why I think as we get older, if we're not reproducing, then we become sterile. We become unable to reproduce. So multiplication and reproduction is an important biological principle. So one of the things that we tell churches when we do church planting is make sure that don't become so big that you don't reproduce. If a church is healthy, it will grow, mature, and reproduce. If it doesn't, then what's going to happen? Here's one of the things that I think is important even for this church. You have a Korean congregation that's predominantly Korean speaking. So the question for you is, how do we then reproduce our church to reach the next generation? That's an important question. Because if you don't reproduce and reach the next generation, guess what's going to happen to the Korean church in 10 years? It's going to not exist. And so if you don't have a vision for reproduction and multiplication, you end up basically becoming, it's like as we get older, my parents are seniors now, in their 80s, approaching their 90s. If they didn't have kids, then they would eventually die out. As somebody once told me, the church is only one generation from becoming extinct. We have a responsibility to reproduce and multiply. So healthy things grow, growing things mature, and mature things reproduce. So there's one last thing I want to share with you. So how do you grow a healthy church? So this is actually from Ephesians chapter 4, verses 14 to 16. I'm just going to give you very simple biblical principles on how you develop a growing, healthy church. It says in Ephesians 4, 14 to 16, there will be no longer infants tossed back and forth by the waves, blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by cunning craftiness of men in their deceitful scheme. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we in all things grow up in him who is Christ, who is the head, is Christ. From him the whole body, joined together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. So one of the things that Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 4 is what the human body is like. As all our human body is connected, in the same way, spiritually, we are connected. So, how do you grow? How do you know what a healthy church looks like? Well, a healthy church grows by assessing people towards spiritual maturity. So the first thing that Paul says here is making sure that we are no longer infants. People have to be growing spiritually. Now, let me say this, and I don't want to offend you when I say that. You could be an old Christian and not be a mature Christian. Does that make sense? You could be in church all your life for 40, 50 years and still not be mature. Is a church producing spiritual maturity? Meaning, are we producing a mindset that is causing us to be mature. One of the things he says here in Ephesians 4, that one of the symptoms of immaturity is they're tossed back and forth by the waves. In other words, they're not stable. So a healthy church, first of all, produces stability. If you're not stable, if you're always fluctuating, going back and forth, then that's a mark of immaturity. So even spiritually, when things get difficult, spiritual maturity allows us to be stable when life gets difficult. Secondly, it's marked by discernment. It says here in Ephesians 4:14, not only are we not blown back and forth, we are not led by every wind of teaching and deceitful scheming. In other words, we have spiritual maturity and spiritual discernment. Sound doctrine is a critical part of spiritual growth. Now, second part is this. A healthy church grows by balancing truth with love. This is what, I went to a church that was very truth-focused. They taught the Bible very well, but the people were not very loving. and that's unhealthy. So they taught really strongly God's word, but people are very cold. It's like walking into I call a refrigerator. People are almost like a cemetery. But then the other side is this. Churches that could be very loving without truth is also dangerous. So I've been to churches where everybody loves each other, but yet they don't teach truth. And as a result, people just go anywhere they want, and that's unhealthy as well. So how do you know a healthy church, as Paul says? Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up in him. So it's marked by integrity, and love is marked by sincerity. People genuinely have a love for each other. There's nothing better to go to a place where there's genuine affection for people. Now, lastly, before we close our time, a healthy church grows by cultivating interdependency. And what I mean by that is that a church should be broad in its reach. Like the human body, as it grows, it supports each other. Every ligament grows and builds itself up. Every ligament and all the different parts of the body work together in unison. A healthy church cultivates interdependency, meaning this, that our children are developed, our youth are developed, our young adults are developed. It's multicultural, it's multi-ethnic, it's multi-generational. You know what the best experience I had as a pastor? I started the church 20 years ago in California. And back then it was me and my wife and a few other young couples. We didn't have any children. And the greatest experience came about 16, 17 years later. One day we were leading worship. I was preaching a sermon. Do you know who was leading our worship? Were all the youth that had been born and raised up in our church. They were leading the church in worship. And I thought to myself, this is the most beautiful picture I've ever seen. Because our kids are leading us instead of, the adults leading the kids. And I look upon that time and I said, a church is healthy when the generation continues to minister to each other. Another key aspect is healthy churches are marked by unity, meaning that we have a single vision. We work together. We're not fighting each other. The number one thing that the devil loves to see is churches fighting each other, because the mark of disunity is really the mark in which the Satan wants to use to destroy the church. Mark of unity is a mark of health and maturity. Interdependence is marked by love. And again, Paul says this over and over again. And Jesus says this, all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. So Christ is the one that is central to holding the church together. And it's important as leaders, really emphasizing that is, we are Christ's body. The pastor is not the head of the church. Christ is the head of the church. People ask me, after 20 years of leaving the church that I started, it's like leaving my baby. It was one of the hardest decisions, but it was also one of the best decisions, because I realized that this church is not me. I'm not the head. After I left, the church continues to grow and thrive. That's how you know it's healthy. That the church continued to grow without the founding pastor. And that's the thing I celebrate more than anything. So let me summarize everything. Number one, growth comes through sound teaching, sound doctrine, meaning to have a very clear focus on God's word. Second part is respect others with integrity. There's a sense of respect and mutuality that happens in the church. Thirdly, observe the need of others through love. Serve one another, but also love the community that God has called us. And lastly, work together through the use of your spiritual gifts. So as I think about all the different experiences I had as a senior pastor, I do a lot of church consulting. I do consulting churches in Chicago, LA. Currently, I'm working with a Chinese church. And it's funny, the Chinese church is very similar to the Korean church. That church congregation is looking for a new English pastor. They've been around for maybe 45, 50 years as well. And one of the first things I reminded them is, just because we're a mature, older congregation doesn't mean we're a healthy congregation. And now they're looking for, hopefully, before they hire a new pastor, I told them the number one thing you do is to get healthier. Because if you're not healthy, it doesn't matter who you bring. Sometimes we believe that by bringing one pastor, it's going to change our church. It may not change for the better. It actually may change for the worse. What we have to focus on is getting healthy. So that's my presentation on marks of a healthy church based upon the research by Christian Swartz. So any questions, any comments on, or any examples you want to give?
Now this is your time, okay? The seminar like this, you have to understand, we actually pastor pay almost $1,000 to just attend a seminar like this, okay? You guys actually getting free. Okay, that's good. And so if there's any question that you have, I will give you a mic. You will have 15 seconds to ask a question. So is there anyone? Anyone that want to ask? Okay, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the first things that I love to do when I go to church is to do like church health being a church health consultant is like, in some sense, being a spiritual doctor. You know, before when you see a doctor, the first thing they have to do is a battery of tests to see what, you know, to determine what the issues are. In the same way, I would encourage you, there are actually some good tests out there that determine that help you evaluate the markers. If we want to use this criteria, this is from the book called Natural Church Development by Christian Swartz. There's actually a test out there. So every church can take the same test and kind of evaluate where are we in terms of the scale. I think it may be translated in Korean as well. So I do recommend, Joe, that one of the things that if you have a hard time deciding what are some of our issues, then maybe taking an assessment might be a good step. I can let Brandon Song know about that, Pastor Brandon.
Any more? This is very important if you have any questions. Anybody? Okay, good. Edwin? Edwin first.
Yes. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great question, Edwin. I think one of the things that is a challenge for when Koreans immigrated to America, We know that in 1964, there was the Immigration Act by Lyndon Johnson that opened up the gates from the east to the west. And many of the Koreans who first immigrated to America, a lot of them came after that Immigration Act. My parents came in 71. And so naturally, when you're an ethnic community, what ends up happening is that the church becomes the place in which assimilation takes place. What I mean by assimilation is sociological assimilation. So a lot of Koreans, when they first came to America, even though they weren't Christians, ended up at a Korean church. And so the Korean church, in many ways, became the hub for ethnic identity. So that's where we come to enjoy, to see other Korean people. That Sundays, that's why Korean food is so important, because Sundays we eat together, especially in communities maybe that are more spread out. In Los Angeles, now there are so many Korean churches, but again, the Korean churches for the first generation served as a place where identity was maintained. Now what happened is as the parents who are now becoming more assimilated, they're starting to have children. And so what do they do with their children? They decided, well, our children are leaving the church. They call that the silent exodus. All these kids were leaving. So the church said, okay, we need to start an English ministry to keep our kids. Now, here was the problem. This is what I was an EM pastor, so I was a 영어 예배 목사. And so I worked at a large Korean church in LA. I worked in a large Korean church in Washington, D.C., 중앙 장로교회. It was one of the larger churches. And they were having this English ministry, but the problem with the English ministry was we asked the question, why are you having an English ministry? Well, we want to keep our kids. We want to keep our kids in the Korean identity. And I remember one conversation I had with a young adult like Edwin. I asked him, why don't you bring your non-Korean friends to our church? And they said to me, Chang Muksa, Pastor Ray, we cannot do that because this is a Korean church. It's for Koreans. And I said, when did the gospel become a limitation, even though they speak English? And so we changed our model of our English ministry, not focusing on just English-speaking Koreans. We began to expand that model and say, we want to reach anybody. And so we started to reach out to a lot of mixed couples. Secondly, we started reaching out to couples that had adopted Korean kids. We started reaching out to kids, Koreans who are now second generation married to non-Koreans like Chinese and others. And then we started reaching out to Pan-Asian. And our church began to grow. It was interesting because English became a tool for us to reach our community. But what happened was from the first generation, Korean became a source of unity. But in the second generation, English is not the source of unity anymore. Even our cultural identity. Being Korean doesn't make us any more special than being anyone else. So we shifted our focus. So that's one of the things that I think is important. You live in a community where there's a lot of second generation now, not just Korean, but Chinese and others. So the question is, when we talk about multiplication and reproduction, maybe as elders to think about how can the English congregation be extended to reach the broader community more than just reaching just Koreans. And I think that's important because whether we like it or not, our children are not going to just marry Koreans. Like if you live in LA, yes, there's a higher percentage, or live in New York, there's a higher percentage. But you grow up in North Carolina, you grow up in Virginia, you grow up in Georgia, you grow up in Ohio, some of these other places, you see a lot more mixed families, especially as they go to the university. So one of the exciting things that I see is among the next generation, there's a greater hunger for spiritual things. So the church could either hinder that or enhance that. And so that's one of the things I would say, Edwin, is for the church to focus on kind of renewing. What is our vision for the English ministry? And that's an important question. Does that answer? Does that help?
I think sort of.
Okay.
All right. Any more? Okay, how about Jake?
Mhm.
So what's your consultant view of where does presbytery role is and where is the church leadership role
Yeah.
to bring forth a unity in the church where the church can thrive?
Yeah.
Is it like, I guess, so how does, like, do you say this has to dominate over this?
Yeah.
You know, what is your consulting
Well,
view of that?
thank you for that question, Jay. Church polity is sometimes complicated. Every church has different. I grew up in a Presbyterian church, so I was part of the Korean church, actually PCA in Washington D.C. area, and so I understand the principle of in a Presbyterian church. I think every church has some level of autonomy. Now, in a Baptist church, they have full autonomy. There's no in a Presbyterian church, there's a partnership between the session, the synod, and group. It's almost like I said, a good partnership. I think in every system, it can be healthy, unhealthy. I think the key in the Presbyterian system is to make sure that the leadership, whoever the leaders are, the elders, the presbytery, the session, have a good, working relationship with the denomination, right? Now, in the Presbytery, unlike the Methodists, which has more of a kind of what we call an Episcopal structure where it's top down, there's a lot more freedom in the Presbyterian church. So I would say that question really is up to your leadership of how you want to run this. I have, like I said, my job is not to tell a system, this is how you run. I could see unhealthy aspects of that system, but every system can have unhealth. Every system can be healthy as well. So I would say in a Presbyterian church, the key is to make sure that there's a healthy relationship between the leadership with the church as well as leadership in the denomination and making sure that they're on the same page. So again, I know that's a lot more broader answer, but again, it's difficult for me because I don't know the system of how the Korean church runs here. So I can't give you any specific consultation other than you need to have clear communication and clear dialogue. Maybe Pastor Sung could give a better.
All right. 2 more questions, and we're going to call it up. And if there is anyone want to ask, this is a great opportunity to ask. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Your word will not be on the website. Okay? Don't be afraid. Anyone? Anyone? Any question? Pastor Ray, is there any the place where offers seminars for the church leaders to go and get some training, have some mentorship?
Yeah.
Is there any place like that?
There's lots of conferences depending upon what the church is looking for. I could give you a list of. There's some great seminars, great conferences. I think for my biggest concern for the Korean church is that we are making the same mistake as some of the American churches where we are not. My biggest concern is we're not reaching the young people. Here's the best news, though. George Barna, who's a sociologist, he did a study, and he found out in the white evangelical culture, the American, sort of the broader Caucasian culture, among the young people, they are, we call it Generation X, Generation Y, Generation Z. They're leaving the church. But he said that the numbers totally hasn't changed. And the reason he says it hasn't changed is that the greatest growth of Christianity in America are among the ethnic Generation Z. In other words, the second generation is actually more faithful in their attendance than other generations. So there's some hope. So I want to encourage you, really think about, and as a parent, I have 2 daughters in college. My concern is more for their spiritual well-being. We as older Christians, God has blessed us, and we've done a lot in the church. But now I want to encourage you to really pray for that next generation, because that's what my heart is as well. So thank you, Pastor Brandon.
Thank you so much. And I think most important thing is not so much of learning great teachings and whatnot. It's time for you to practice. I think that's what important is. And so thank you so much, Pastor Ray. I really enjoyed, and thank you for being my friends and coming here. and then just coming to even a small church and serve. And I'm really thankful for that. So why don't we give him a big hands and let's pray. Thank you. And Lord, thank you so much. What an opportunity to learn the great lessons. What church is, what is a healthy church, what is unhealthy. God, there's so many things to learn. But Lord, I will challenge our young people here, much younger than me, that Lord, that they catch the vision for a younger generation as well, to really reaching out. And there are things that we can help and we can do. We can take a part in sharing the word and developing leaders and mobilize our people, going to the world and share the word. And Lord, just let us be passionate about it and give a sense of calling, the call to live as a believer.